The long ages recorded in the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11 have long been a topic of debate and fascination among biblical scholars. I've recently had the opportunity to sit down with a distinguished scholar who holds a unique position on the matter. While firmly believing that these ages are historical and not merely symbolic, he also asserts there being gaps in the genealogies. Interestingly, he still believes in a young earth. Journey with us as we unravel the threads of his compelling arguments and delve into the reason behind his intriguing convictions. Hey everyone, this is what your pastor can tell you today. I am on with Dr. Andrew Steinmann. We're going to be talking about the Genesis genealogies. Why are people living so long? Are there gaps? What does that say about the age of the earth? How are you doing today, Dr. Steinmann?
I'm doing fine. Hope you are too.
Yes, it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
This has been I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I just for people that aren't familiar with your work, can you give us just a background of yourself and what you've written on in the past?
Yeah, well, I just retired from Concordia University, Chicago, where I was distinguished professor of theology and Hebrew. I taught there for 23 years. I've also been a parish pastor and a nursing home chaplain and taught at other institutions as well. I got a bachelor's degree from University of Cincinnati, a master's of divinity from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of Michigan. I've written on any number of Old Testament subjects. I've written commentaries on Genesis, as well as Daniel, First and Second Samuel, Ezra, Nehemiah. I have a commentary on Ezra that is yet to be published. Um, I've also written on some New Testament topics, particularly surrounding the chronology of Jesus' birth and ministry. And I've written an entire book on Bible chronology,
Wow.
one of my expertises. So I've written a lot.
Yeah, no, this is an absolute pleasure to talk about. So that's a big background there. Obviously, you've written on some topics of the genealogies, a good amount like that. So that's why we're here. For those not familiar with the topic, what would you say is the significance to the topic of genealogies in the long ages?
Yeah, well, I think the significance here is that the Bible is portraying real people, and it's portraying the blessing of God on those people, that they live long lives. And for me, the genealogies are not primarily about chronology. They're about the messianic promise that's given first to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:15, and tracing the messianic line down from Adam first to Noah in the genealogy in Genesis 5, and then from Noah's son Shem down to Abram in the genealogy in Genesis 11. And the thread that I think runs throughout the book of Genesis is the messianic promise. This is what Abraham gets when he's promised that all the nations of the world be blessed through him. And it even is almost at the very end of the book of Genesis with Jacob on his deathbed with his blessings on his sons, and he blesses Judah and promises the messianic line to come from Judah.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, the genealogies are more about Jesus than they are about calculating dates.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Of course, you've got, the conflict with science and does it actually conflict or not, or all these questions of historicity and age of the earth and all that. So obviously that's a hot topic. Um, but yeah, we're gonna have to dive into that a little bit, what you just said
Yes.
there. So in regards to history, do you think the possibility that there are gaps or the numbers are symbolic would hinder the doctrine of inspiration?
No, I don't think so, because we can demonstrate there are gaps in genealogies elsewhere in the Bible. And that's been recognized for centuries and centuries, and it's never bothered anybody who believes in the inspiration of Scripture. Most famously, if we go to the New Testament, Matthew opens up with Jesus' genealogy, and there, he arranges it so he has three sets of 14 generations, and he does that by skipping some generations that are actually listed in the Old Testament. And nobody's ever said, well, that disqualifies Matthew from being inspired.
Hmm.
So the idea that genealogies can skip generations um, is maybe strange to us, because when we do genealogies nowadays, and in fact, I've researched my own, we don't skip generations. We try to find every generation going all the way back. But the Bible writers don't always do that.
Hmm.
The longest genealogy in the Old Testament is the genealogy of Ezra in the book of Ezra. And it very clearly skips some generations. And nobody said, well, Ezra's not inspired. And this was known in antiquity. And, the people who believed in inspiration in antiquity didn't have any trouble with it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting when you read the different cultures back then and even today in ancient Near Eastern countries where we have the genealogies and they have no issue skipping them, which is such a weird thing. But from our perspective, so from a Hebrew grammar perspective, there's the question of like, is this even possible? Because when you look at the text, it says stuff like, Adam begot Seth, which is like most people are going to interpret as Adam gave birth to a child named Seth, and that's it. Like you can't have gaps in there because that's what it says. But can you help us understand how that works in the Hebrew? I mean, is that a good translation? What are we supposed to think about that?
Yeah, well, translators in this case have a problem in that English doesn't have a way of adequately expressing what the Hebrew is saying there. It's not that it's so much of a mistranslation, is that unless you want to make the genealogy pages and pages long by putting in a full translation that tries to get to every nuance of the verb,
Hmm.
you can't do it. And nobody
Mm.
wants a Bible that gets that long. So when it says begat in English or fathered or something like that, that's an attempt to approximate the Hebrew verb. But the verb form here is an interesting one. Hebrew verbs will have the verb root will have several different conjugations, and the way the verb is conjugated, the way it's formed, will tell you something about the action. So there's a basic formation that just tells you the action. But there is a formation that adds cause to the action. So, for instance, if you had the word to go in Hebrew, well, then to cause to go would be that one, which ends up being bring in English.
Hmm.
Okay, well, here we have the causative form of the verb throughout these genealogies. It's not um, fathered or begat. The verb actually means to bear a child. It's used elsewhere that way in its basic meaning. And in the causative meaning, then it's to cause someone to bear a child.
Hmm.
And as often happens with these causative verbs, sometimes there's two direct objects then. Cause someone, first direct object, to bear a child, second direct object. And often with these verbs, when they're used, one of the direct objects is left out, as kind of assumed or not needed to be expressed. We do this sometimes in English, leave out a direct object. If somebody tells you something and you already know it, you'll say, well, I know. You know what, right? There's a direct object there you've left
Yeah.
out, but it doesn't need to be expressed. Everybody kind of understands the kind of implied direct object when you do that in English. So we do the same thing at times. Well, in these genealogies, it really says, um, for instance, Adam caused someone, presumably Eve, to bear Seth. Now, sometimes he caused the next generation. We can see that with Adam and Seth; those are clearly father and son. And there are other
Hmm.
places in the Genesis genealogies where we know someone named their son a certain name, so probably implies that's father to son. But it doesn't mean that in the other generations that we don't know that it goes directly to the son. It could be a grandson, a great grandson. You can cause the birth of somebody many generations down the line simply by your actions now. And that happens with causatives, even in English, right? You can do something, cause something, but the result doesn't happen for some time later. There can be a time gap.
Hmm.
And the verb actually is used this way in a couple of places where it's pretty obvious. So in Deuteronomy 4:25, this verb is used in the causative, and Moses is telling the people of Israel, when you come into the land of Israel, and when you have children and grandchildren. Now, have there is cause the birth of. Now, you can beget children, but you can't beget grandchildren. It doesn't mean beget there. It means cause the birth of grandchildren. Okay, and you can cause them by getting married and having children of your own, right? But you can't beget grandchildren. So right there, we know it's being used as a causative. There's another place in 2 Kings 20:18, which has a parallel in Isaiah 37:9, where Hezekiah, it's prophesied to him that he will cause the birth of children who will be taken into captivity and be made eunuchs. Now, that's very unlikely to be his children. They would have to have been, by the time the Babylonian captivity happened, at least in their 80s, if not over 100 years old. Nobody's going to make eunuchs out of men that are, 80 years old or something like that. There's no point to it. You would make a eunuch out of a man if you're going to have him serve in your royal court or something like that. So again, it's causative. It's talking about some descendants of Hezekiah, 2 or 3 or 4 generations down the line, that he is going to cause the birth of. And so we can very clearly see this causative. So when we have statements like so and so was X years old and he caused the birth of, and then we have another name, we only know he at a certain point in time something happened to him that caused an eventual birth down the line somewhere. And unless we have additional information to say that was a son and not a grandson or a great grandson, we don't know how many generations are between the one person and the other.
That's
and this is
fascinating.
why you could have gaps.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense because, if we're assuming a certain type of way to interpret the word, then that could have an issue with, the Bible's lying or the Bible's wrong. But if we're interpreting, why can't I pronounce that?
Yes, there you go.
If we are interpreting it correctly, then that makes a lot more sense. Okay, so you notice you point out a lot of times in your works that there are gaps all over the place in the genealogies in the Bible. So before we even dive into Genesis 5 and 11 in that regard, let's talk about some other texts. Do you have any ones that in particular that stand out as far as like this is obviously a gap in the genealogy?
Yeah, I think the genealogy of David that we find at the end of the book of Ruth is a very good example. It's 10 generations long, and it extends from before the Exodus, really from one of the sons of Jacob, all the way down to David. Now, there has to be more than 10 generations during that time period. And in a matter of fact, if you look in the book of Leviticus and look at the priestly line that starts with Korah and goes down, during that same period of time, in that genealogy, there's 19 generations. Now, why is that important? Well, if you're a priest, you or a Levite serving in the Old Testament, you have to prove your descent. If you're a priest, you have to prove that you're descended from Aaron. And so they wouldn't skip generations in that case because they want to show every link so that they can show that, yes, I am eligible to be a priest. So there's 19 generations in the priestly line. In the kingly line leading to David, there's only 10. Now, what's the chances of that? I mean, it might be 19 versus 17 or 19 versus 18 or 19 versus 20 or something like that, but it wouldn't be 19 versus 10. Um, and you can also look within that genealogy and see some other interesting things. And so, from the time of the Exodus to the time of David, you can compare it, and I've done that in my papers, and you can see that there's problems there too. There has to be gaps in that genealogy, and I think there's a reason for the gaps in those genealogies. David is the 10th person, and 10 is a very significant number in the Bible, especially in the Pentateuch. And I think the genealogy in Ruth is imitating the genealogies in the Pentateuch. And 7 is a very significant number in the Pentateuch. Well, Boaz happens to be number 7, and David happens to be number 10 in that genealogy. And I think the author of Ruth skipped generations to make that happen, so that he could highlight Boaz, who's, the most important man in the book of Ruth. Maybe not the most important person, that'd probably be Ruth or Naomi, but the most important man. And David, of course, is very important because he's the great king of Israel in the Old Testament. So what the author has done there is he skipped generations in order to highlight certain people. And this is not uncommon. As I mentioned before, if you go to Ezra's genealogy, Ezra, who's from a priestly line, there are several high priests that are left out of his genealogies in the book of Ezra. And the reason for that is probably it was a very long genealogy and they didn't want to take up a lot of space, so that they shortened it a little bit. And you can actually find the names of the people that are left out in the Ezra genealogy. In fact, in my commentary on Ezra and Nehemiah, I show that genealogy and show you which names are left out.
Very fascinating. Okay, so for someone might still be skeptical. It's like, okay, those names in that specific places, David and gosh, I already forgot the other one.
Boaz.
But yeah, David and Boaz, they are in some interesting spot, but it could be a coincidence. So when you're comparing a genealogy of 20 or 19 compared with 10, scientifically, it's possible, like, maybe they have children later or something like that. Like, you don't see that as a possibility here?
Well, it could be, but the problem is that the grammar doesn't allow you just to say, I'm going to assume this is father to son and add things up. It just doesn't work. And it causes other problems in the genealogies, too, if you make that assumption. And in fact, it's usually assumed that when the people want to add these things up, that, so-and-so was, let's say, 200 years old, and he had a son. And it's assumed, well, 200 years old means that's when the son was born. And so we can, start adding things up. But there are 2 places in the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 where that clearly is wrong. And this has been known again since antiquity. One is that we're told that Noah had his 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, right? He caused their birth when he was 500 years old. Now, first of all, that would require them to be triplets. They're all direct objects. It's a compound direct object of the one verb. And if it's a compound direct object, if it happened to one, it happened to all 3. So you have to put all 3 of their birth when Noah was 500 years old. Well, then we're told that twice when Noah went on the ark and the flood started, Noah was 600 years old. Okay, so they all have to be 100 years old at that point. But then when we get to the genealogies, we see that we are told that Shem had a son when he was 100 years old, 2 years after the flood. Well, if you assume he was born when Noah was 500, he should have been 102 years old, not 100 years old. So that doesn't work very well right there. But it gets even worse when we get to Abraham and his brothers. Now, Terah, Abraham's father, we are told how old he is, 70 years old, and he has three sons, just like Noah. Uh, and later on in Genesis 12:4, we're told that Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran, and this is placed in Genesis after the death of Terah. But Terah died at the age of 205 years. So if you do a little arithmetic there, you find out that Terah was actually 130 years old when Abram was born. You take 205, subtract 75, you get 130.
Hmm.
So trying to understand that, oh, they caused the birth meant that's when the child was born,
Mm-hmm.
that's obviously not correct. Now, this again was recognized in antiquity. And there were attempts in antiquity to try to deal with it. So in the Septuagint, the Greek version of Genesis that was translated in antiquity, they make a couple little changes to try to deal with this. They say that Terah lived in Haran for 205 years. And they think they've solved the problem there. Okay. So what they actually did is they adjusted the text because they recognized a problem. Interestingly enough, if we go to the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Pentateuch is preserved by the Samaritans. The Samaritans only recognize the 5 books of Moses as scripture. What they do there is they adjust the numbers to make them work out all right. So they actually changed the text again because they understood all the text that we received has a problem if we make this assumption. And so they actually changed the numbers to fit their assumption rather than changing their assumption. It's kind of like you've got a jigsaw puzzle, and this piece, I think it should go here, but doesn't fit. So I'm going to get out the scissors and make it fit. Well, that's a problem. And again, these problems have been recognized since antiquity, and there have been modern attempts to solve it. So in some Bible translations, when you come to Terah, instead of saying when Terah was so many years old, it says after Terah was so many years old, to try to solve the problem. The problem is that the same wording that's used for Terah bearing his children, or begetting, or fathering, or causing them to be born, to be more accurate, the same wording is used everywhere else in those genealogies. It's a formula. So if the formula means after in the case of Terah, then it probably means after in the case of everybody else. And if it's after, then you can't calculate because you don't know how long after.
Hmm.
So, like I said, this has been recognized for centuries and centuries, going all the way back to antiquity. But nobody wants to cope with the real issue. And the real issue, the Hebrew does not say when so and so was so many years old, his son was born. It doesn't say that. It says he caused someone, unstated, to bear a child. And once you realize that, then you realize some of these may be father to son, and we have that. So Noah's father named him Noah for a reason. We're told this in the book of Genesis, so we know that one is father to son. But some of them we're not told that. We don't know where the gaps may or may not be here, but there definitely are potential for gaps here. And so you can't just add it up and say, well, we know when the flood happened, or we know when creation happened.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So you also wrote in your papers about Exodus 6. Would you mind bringing up that topic here?
The genealogy of Moses and Aaron. Yeah, so we have their genealogy there. It's really short, only a few generations, and we know that the people of Israel were in Egypt for 430 years. And it can't just be a few generations, 3 or 4 generations. It has to be more than that. There again, you have use the words daughter or son. And in Hebrew, son or daughter can mean the way we use it, the next generation. But son or daughter has a much wider meaning in Hebrew. Son can sometimes be used to mean a grandson, a great grandson, any male descendant. The same with daughter. So when you look at that genealogy of Moses and Aaron there, and it says son or daughter, you have to understand that might mean granddaughter or great granddaughter or grandson or great grandson. And we should probably know this from the New Testament, where Jesus is called Son of David, and is very clearly not the next generation from David. So that makes it quite obvious that when you have genealogies that say so and so son of so and so, you have to be very careful. Do you have other information that it actually means son, or can it mean grandson or great grandson?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah, and of course, there's been lots of debate on, when the Exodus was and how we're supposed to date that 430, and a lot of people see it as symbolic or that it's an approximation or something. But there's also evidence in First Chronicles 7 that the time span of 4 generations that Exodus 6 portrays might have been a lot longer than that. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, there are other genealogies, and if you look at the other genealogies in Chronicles starts out with genealogies of many of the tribes, not all the tribes, but many of the tribes. And if you look at those genealogies, you'll see that there's more generations there. So in First Chronicles 7, I'm trying to remember which tribe it is now.
Ephraim.
Sometimes. Oh, pardon?
Ephraim.
Oh, Ephraim. Yeah, if you look at the generations of Ephraim, you will see that there's many more than 4 generations there. That goes from Joseph's son Ephraim down to the Exodus. And so it's pretty clear that, again, with Moses being from the tribe of Levi, there were more than 3 or 4 generations for Moses. For Ephraim, there's many more. And so, again, you just have to get used to the idea that sometimes when giving a genealogical notice in the Bible, the authors simply skip over generations. They're only interested maybe in the more important people in the genealogy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like your comment earlier that, when we're asking, like, maybe it's still possible that these are literal and we're just, assuming too much. But you said like we can't just assume that it's literal. That's not the default. And
Right.
that's a really interesting approach. Even one of your works, you said that at least like something like half or even more than half of the genealogies have gaps in it. So in that case, like there's no way we should assume that it has no gaps by default.
Yes, I think you just have to remember that we can't bring our modern view and impose it on ancient Israelites. We have to ask, what were the ancient Israelites doing and how did they understand things? This
Mm,
comes up all the time. Sometimes I've seen this where people will argue, well, a straightforward interpretation of this would be, well, what's straightforward? What makes sense to you, or would have made sense to an ancient writer and an ancient reader?
true. Right.
Um, and so I resist the idea of a straightforward reading. I always ask, no, what reading did the author intend?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're up to. And we could talk about the divine author, God, but the divine author worked through human authors who wrote in their own language to people who were reading it with their own assumptions in antiquity.
Mm-hmm.
How would the ancients have read this?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
would they have expected? Not how would a modern person read this and what makes sense to a modern person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, could you give us, you mentioned it before, but could you give us a little bit of a summary of uh, just a general idea of what's going on between the different texts, whether it be Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, Masoretic text? Um, there's different ways that people have summarized, like, oh, maybe the Septuagint is adding so many years. What's going on? Just give a just general summary.
Yeah, well, I did a study of all the variants in the text between those three texts: the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text, the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is in Hebrew too. So we have one in Greek and two in Hebrew. And what you find out in general is the Masoretic text tends not to add things, and when it has when it there's a transmission error, these had to be copied year after year over. When it has a what we would say is a mistaken text, it's oftentimes simply somebody miscopied something, not an intentional. There are a few intentional things. The Samaritan Pentateuch has some very intentional changes, and you can see this when you compare all the variants across Genesis from Genesis 1 through Genesis 50.
Hmm.
And the Septuagint has even more of these intentional changes. Now, when we get to the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11, what we find is that both the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint are adjusting the ages of people because they perceive a problem in the text. So Septuagint is the most egregious of these in the Genesis 11 genealogies. If you took the Masoretic text and you just assume again, you could add those ages up and so forth. When Abram is born, a lot of those people in that genealogy would still be alive, going, all the way back to the beginning of the genealogies, which is kind of ridiculous when you think of it, that he would have that many ancestors still alive. Not just his father or his grandfather, but, going all the way back to Shem. And then, when Ishmael is alive, 4 of those people would have still been alive when Ishmael is born. And when Isaac's born, some of them would still be alive. And it just becomes ridiculous. And when you also note that Abraham at one point doubts whether he's going to have children because he's 100 years old. Am I vigorous enough to have children? Right? Because he's worried about God's promise that he's going to have a son. And how can Abraham be worried about being vigorous enough to have a child at 100 years old if he still had ancestors that were 300 and 400 and 500 years old that were still alive? It doesn't make any sense. It defies logic. And so what the Septuagint did is it went through with quite a number of those ancestors and reduced their ages by 100 years, which ended up making them not being around. Only Abraham's great-grandfather, grandfather, and father would have been around under those circumstances if you just reduce the numbers of certain ancestors 100 years. The Samaritan Pentateuch goes even further and reduces the numbers, so only Abraham's father is alive when Abram is born. Okay, so again, they recognized a problem, and instead of adjusting their view of the text, they adjusted the text itself. And you can see that this is a general tendency, especially in the Septuagint. We're going to adjust things whenever we see that there is a perceived problem in the text. One that doesn't have to do with genealogies, just to give you an example of this. When Joseph brings his 2 sons in to have his father bless them in Egypt, Jacob adopts those 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own. And he says, these will be counted as my children. If you have more children, they'll be counted as your children. Okay, well, Joseph never has any more children. So what does the Septuagint do? They see that as a problem. So later on, instead of saying Joseph had 2 children, they say Joseph had 9 children. Then it solves that perceived problem. And this is something that the Septuagint does all over the place. Wherever they see something might be a problem, they'll change the text a little bit in order to solve that perceived problem. They're doing that in the genealogies here. In Genesis 5, they adjust the ages, and in Genesis 11, they adjust the ages again. And it solves some of these perceived problems. So again, we note that the problem with adding up the genealogies and determining chronology was recognized already in antiquity. It's not some problem that we've just recognized in modern times. It was recognized in antiquity, and they tried to deal with it in their own way.
Hmm.
Probably not a good way. You just change God's word to match your expectations. But that's what they did.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so fascinating how, you know, people today, it's like, you do not change God's word. They get all upset with translations. And you have people back then just doing it, and I can't even wrap my mind around it, honestly. But so in the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, you have a lot of people that are thinking, hey, you've got the ages of when the people are born, you have, or when the father gives birth at least. Um, then you have the total lives lived and how long they live after being born. And it looks, I like, a lot of people think that it looks like there is, a record being, a chronology being built here to, for, like, why else put all these different numbers in here? It's very detailed if we're not trying to figure out, the age of the earth, or how long it took between this time and this time. What do you think about that? Like, do you see that intuition? Does that make any sense to you?
Well, I understand the reasoning behind that and the impulse to go that way. And again, the impulse was there in antiquity, but I think in my mind, it kind of misses the point of these genealogies. I think the point of these genealogies is just show the ancestors of the Messiah and how God gives this promise and sees it through history. Now, history slows down in the book of Genesis when you get to Abraham.
Hmm.
But he sees his promise through history. And I think the point of these ages is to show God's blessing on these people, that they live long lives. um, People often say, "Well, how come they lived such long lives before the flood?" Well, I don't know that everybody was living really long lives before the flood. I only know about 10 individuals, really, Adam to Noah. For all I know, people were living longer lives before the flood, but not as long as these guys. I mean, we don't know. Again, we're making an assumption about something we don't know because we only have 10 individuals.
Hmm.
And we have 10 individuals in the messianic line that have God's blessings. Clearly, a person like Enoch has God's blessing where God took him and he didn't even die, right? Took him directly to heaven. Um, Seth has God's blessing because he's the one son from Adam that leads to this messianic line. Cain's disqualified because he killed Abel, and Abel's not around to do it. So there you have God's blessing. So I look at these long lives as saying God bless these individuals. Now we know God blesses individuals and gives them long lives by looking at other people in the Bible. Moses lives 120 years. Certainly way out of line for people in Moses' day, whose lifespan usually ended at around 50. And if they were really lucky, they might have made it to 70. Nowadays, we have people living 70, 80, 90 years old. It's become really common because of modern science. But in
Hmm.
antiquity, if you lived to be 50, that was pretty ripe old age.
Hmm.
Here, Moses lives 120. Why? Because God blessed him as the leader of Israel. We have Joseph who lives a long life because God blessed him. David lives, a fairly long life for his day. He lives to be 70. Very few of the kings of Israel live to be 70 years old. We have the ages of them listed in the book of Kings, and 70 is a good long life. So again, we know that people were blessed by God to live long lives, and I think that's what's going on with these individuals in these genealogies. As it shows God's blessing on them because God chose them to be ancestors
Hmm.
of the Messiah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the logic goes that you see these ages in the text, and while our intuition might be to think a specific way, there's a number of different options. And what you're saying is the it seems like, with well, I guess maybe you can flesh that out a little bit. What makes you, when you look at those numbers, think that's God's blessing them? Is there something in the text that says God's blessing them and that's why they're living long? How do you come to that conclusion?
Well, I come to that conclusion because the book of Genesis, Moses in the book of Genesis, is very carefully following the messianic line all the way from
Right.
Adam and Eve down to Judah at the end of the book. And he's mentioning all these names. So he'll follow other people, he'll give you Ishmael and he'll tell you a little bit about Ishmael's descendants, but then he drops it because it's not that important. And when we get the Noah coming off the ark, after the Noah comes off the ark in Genesis 10, we get what's often called the Table of Nations, and he tells you what happened to the descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth,
Hmm.
right? And you get a little bit of their descendants, but he drops Japheth and Ham, and only follows the line of Seth by giving you a genealogy that leads down to Abraham, because that's the messianic line. It's nice to know what happened a little bit to Ham and Ham and Japheth's descendants, but we're really interested in Shem.
Hmm.
And this is how the book of Genesis is set up. It will tell you about some of the sidelights a little bit, but it's always comes back and focuses on the messianic line. It'll tell you a little bit about Ishmael, but it's really interested in Isaac.
Hmm.
It'll tell you about Esau, but it's really interested in Jacob.
Yeah.
So that's what convinces me. That's the point of these genealogies is messianic
Hmm.
and the promise of God, because that's the line that Moses kind of is single-minded in following all the way from Adam to Judah and his brothers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so the question of the gaps is really challenging because there's a lot of narrative involved here. So Adam and Seth have their own little narrative going on. Seth and Enosh, Lamech and Noah, Noah and Shem, Eber and Peleg, Terah and Abram. They all have narratives where they are specifically saying in the narrative that this happened, and they're clearly like related, and Terah obviously was the father of Abraham, uh,
Right.
according to most scholars at least. So that makes things challenging because there's only so many other options as far as gaps otherwise. And a lot of people have said, well, hey, if we have no gaps here, it seems implied that we should have no gaps in these other places. And even if we do, that doesn't give us much room for flexibility if we're going to try to, postulate how many gaps are here or something like that. So,
Yeah.
I mean, what is the potential of there being gaps here with that reasoning here?
Well, there could still be gaps, and if we look at other genealogies, we know that some other genealogies do have some that are father to son and some that aren't. So if we go again to the book of Ruth, we know Jesse was David's father, and it goes
Hmm.
Jesse David at the end of that. We know uh, Boaz has a son, right? The son is mentioned there. We know that's father to son in that genealogy. So we know some of them are father to son, but we also know there has to be some gaps there. So just because we have some that are father to son doesn't mean they're all father to son.
Hmm.
And we can see this in other genealogies. Again, you can go as late as the Gospel of Matthew. We have, Matthew does 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. And we know in some of those there are gaps. And we know some of those are literally father to son.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
there's not a lot of room for gaps in those, but there are gaps. And that's the important part. You can't just say because some are father to son, all are father to son. That
Hmm.
does not logically follow. Um, and I think another thing that I've challenged people on who insist that these are all father to son
Hmm.
is, well, let's do the arithmetic and compare it to a extra biblical chronology. Um, if you do this, add this up, start with Abraham, work backwards to Shem, who survived the flood, you can supposedly date the flood. And people who do that will date the flood, and it's right in the middle of the fifth dynasty of ancient Egypt. So I say to them, explain to me how you can have a flood in the middle of the fifth dynasty of ancient Egypt and immediately afterwards continue on with the fifth dynasty of ancient Egypt. And I'll say to them, now, maybe the solution is the chronology of ancient Egypt that's widely accepted is wrong. Now, there are several chronologies of ancient Egypt, but they all are very similar. You can, in the early dynasties, you can maybe vary it 100 years, but that's not enough to get around the problem. So I challenge them. Well, you can't just say, well, the Bible's right and the ancient chronologies are wrong, because what you're really saying is my interpretation of the Bible is right and the ancient chronologies are wrong. Maybe the Bible is right all along, and so are the ancient chronologies. And I would argue that it's an obscurantist position just to say, well, we're just going to ignore ancient Egyptian history, ancient Mesopotamian history. You have the same problem if you would go to the ancient dynasties in Mesopotamia. Mm-hmm. You would have the same problem. And the problem is that we know these dynasties from inscriptions they left behind, from writings they've left behind. So, either you're going to say those writings are completely wrong. We have writings from pyramids in ancient Egypt, from other, people are very familiar with hieroglyphics and that type of thing. Well, we have those inscriptions that enable us to do all this dating. Again, the early dynasties, we can play with 100 years or so, but that's not enough to get around the problem. And so I challenge people and say, okay, if you're going to say that, then it's incumbent upon you to show where the current chronological understanding of the chronology of ancient Egypt or the chronology of ancient Mesopotamia is wrong. Where is it? Now, I got a degree in ancient Near Eastern studies. I've seen the evidence. I think the evidence is unassailable that the ancient chronologies as we have them are fairly accurate. So show me where they're wrong. Well, nobody ever wants to do that because they can't. It seems to me that what we have here is there are gaps in the genealogies. We don't know how big, but they're gaps. And you can't have a flood in the middle of the fifth dynasty of ancient Egypt. It's just impossible. And it's not enough to say, well, they must be wrong. Go to the evidence, show me where they're wrong. And you can't do it. Nobody's been able to take that challenge and show me. And nobody's even been willing to try, as far as I know. So that I think is something very important. I'm not saying that extra biblical evidence overrules the Bible. I'm saying extra biblical evidence can maybe sift through which interpretation of the Bible is more likely.
Now, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but patterns of evidence, I'm sure you're familiar with them. They've attempted to at least ABR, they attempt to.
They attempt to do this on very questionable grounds. If we leave this out, if we ignore that, sometimes they argue, well, this is based on carbon dating, and carbon dating won't work back that far. Granted, carbon dating won't work back that far, but it's not based on carbon dating. It's based on actual inscriptions.
Yeah. I did a video on how they do dating in Egyptian chronology. Really interesting. So, in your eyes, you've given your interpretation for why they're so long and what's going on there. What would you say are the most popular ways to think about the ages for why they're so long and everything? What is the most popular interpretations?
Yeah, well, the long ages before the flood, oftentimes people will argue that the Earth's climate was different. The climate changed after the flood, and that accounts for the the lifespan's being reduced. I suppose that's a possibility. I'm kind of agnostic on the subject, really, as to why the ages changed.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, you look at it, the ages given in the Genesis 5 genealogy are much longer for people than and they reduce
Mm-hmm.
quickly until you get down to Terah, who's not living as long as people before the flood.
Mm-hmm.
What causes that, I don't know. Whether that is climate, whether there's some other explanation for it. Um, the scripture doesn't say. I don't have any evidence, so I try not to speculate. Absence of evidence is just that. No
Mm-hmm.
evidence. I don't know why. But people have tried to say the climate changed with the flood, and that's what happened. And you see this gradually decaying after the flood, people's lives getting shorter and shorter. But again, I don't know that everybody's lives got shorter and shorter. I only know about the 10 people, or if we combine the genealogies, the 20 people in those two genealogies. I don't know about everybody in those generations and how long they were living. I have no evidence. Maybe these guys were living longer than their contemporaries. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. And I refuse to speculate because that's just speculation. It really
Mm-hmm.
means nothing without any evidence behind it. I do know that, you know, people were living to be about 50 years old, 60 years old. Some people lived to be 70, 80, maybe even 90, but the majority of people lived about 50 years. If they didn't die in a war or die of childhood diseases, they could
Yeah.
live to be about 50 years old. And this goes all the way back to the first dynasty of ancient Egypt and the earliest dynasties in Mesopotamia. We know this to be true. Um, so, what was going on with these gentlemen and why they were living longer?
Mm.
I'm going to give God credit for it and leave it at that.
Mm. But you don't think the numbers are symbolic though, right?
No, I do not think they're symbolic. I think they're actual numbers. And I guess we might get to the science question, but I'll throw it in now.
Okay.
I don't think you can use the gaps in the genealogies to make the Earth millions and billions of years old. That's a ridiculous reading of this text.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know how the Earth is because I don't believe you can base it on Genesis and adding up those ages. And I think the reason that many evangelicals want to add up the ages is because they're nervous about Darwinian evolution or, the neo-Darwinian approach in science. And
Mm-hmm.
so we can't allow any gaps in because all of a sudden they could be millions of years. Nobody, I don't think anybody thinks that that's a reasonable reading of Genesis. Even the most liberal of scholars doesn't believe that Genesis allows for millions of years back to
Mm-hmm.
creation or back
Yeah.
to the beginning of things. I think you're getting nervous over nothing when you do that. I think the Earth is young. I subscribe to a young Earth creationist position, but not a young Earth creationist position that can calculate the age of the Earth based on Genesis.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's a very interesting position, not very rare
Yeah,
out there. Which that's why I don't know when I read something. That's what I figured. I don't remember if you explicitly said that in your papers, and I was like, oh wow, Dr. Simon's taking like an honest approach. I do appreciate that because you're not going out of your field to say, argue all these other things, and two, you are, trying to be reasonable and honest with the data and not letting your, beliefs and, fears, I guess. I appreciate the pursuit of truth there. So, you kind of hinted at it already. So, you think that it's ridiculous to say that we can add up for millions of years, but you've done some calculations or attempted to. What do you think is the maximum amount of time that we could calculate with the genealogies? And is there even an ability to calculate like reasonably, or do we just have no idea?
well, you could say, well, let's assume that we have a gap of um, 12 generations somewhere in the genealogies, and then say, well, the average is so many years, and you could multiply it out and come up and put in another 1,000. 1100. In my paper, I give a number, let's assume an average, and I don't remember exactly what the numbers are anymore, but you could end up with a 1,000, 1,100 extra years or something like that. But that's just an assumption. We don't really know. I can guess, and I want to emphasize this is just a guess. I have no evidence for it. I would guess that you could go back to creation and put it somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000 years ago. Just a guess. I have no evidence for it. Okay. But the way I look at Genesis, it's talking about real people who really lived those ages. There's probably some people missing. The flood certainly didn't happen by adding up the dates and determining it that way. It happened earlier than that. How much earlier, I don't know. I think it happened before recorded history, except for the recorded history in Genesis, of course. But how much before recorded history, I don't know. And I kind of refuse to really be pinned down because, again, no evidence.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's not. Some of these things are not my field. Now, I do hold a degree in engineering, so I have some scientific background. But I'm no scientist. I don't pretend to be a scientist. I do think some scientific theories, like neo-Darwinism, is just ridiculous. And I think it's ridiculous on its face. But it's convinced many people, and many people follow it. I think if you examine its assumptions, it's got some real problems. That being said, I'm not going to try to delve into science to prove my point, because that's not my area of expertise. I'll leave that to other people, and they're very competent Christian scientists. And I don't mean the sect Christian scientists. I mean Christians who are scientists.
Yeah.
Who have written on this, and I think have made very compelling cases. I've read much of their work. I think they make very compelling cases that Darwinian, or we should really say neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory doesn't make any sense, doesn't fit with the actual scientific facts, as opposed to a reconstruction of those facts in the neo-Darwinian evolutionary view of things. So I've read their work. I think it's competent. It's good. I don't have any trouble with it. I'm all on the side of young Earth creationists. I just don't want us to interpret the Bible in such a way that we put ourselves in a box when we don't have to. The Bible doesn't say what you think it says. I think the Hebrew is quite clear that there might be gaps here. Why wed ourselves to a particular interpretation and then we got problems? It's kind of like, the church in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, wedding itself to a geocentric view of the solar system.
Yeah.
Right. And then it turns out to be wrong, and then it calls everything into question.
Yeah.
Why do we want to do that? Let's just stick with what we can say that the text says, and what we can't say, we can't say.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So just to bolster your case a little bit here, you mentioned in your papers about the positions of Enoch, Noah, Eber, and Abram in the genealogies here. What do you think is significant about that, and what conclusions you make based off of that?
Yeah, well, Eber is 7. Enoch is 7th. Noah is 10th. And then if you combine that with the Genesis 11 genealogy, Eber, who gives his name to the Hebrews. Eber is where the word Hebrew comes from. And a very important naming device, by the way, because Abraham one time in the Old Testament is called a Hebrew. So Abram is called a Hebrew one time, and Joseph twice is called a Hebrew. So it's a very important person, Eber. It's Eber then that is placed 14th, double 7. And then Abram and his brothers are the 20th generation. So we have 7 and double 7, 10 and double 10, 20. Now, these are important numbers in the Pentateuch. For instance, the Passover lamb is put aside on the 7th day of the month, sacrificed on the 10th day. Right? You're to give a tenth of all your produce to God. If somebody should kill Cain, this is the curse that God puts on anybody that should kill Cain. What's he going to be avenged? 7 times. Right? And if you start looking at 7 and 10, they're very special numbers in the Pentateuch, unlike any of those other numbers from 1 to 20. Okay. So what do we have here? I think we have, again, conscious positioning of people, skipping over some generations so you can get Enoch as 7, Noah as 10, Eber as 14, and Abram and his brothers at 20.
Yeah.
So I think it shows us gaps. And going back to Ruth, I think the author of Ruth understood that. That's why he puts Boaz at 7 in his genealogy and David at 10. He's imitating what he sees in the Pentateuch, and he's skipping generations to do it. Yeah. So, I think Ruth actually is kind of a reminder, we're continuing on the messianic line that we see in the Pentateuch, because the messianic line goes down to David now. Okay, it starts with one of Judah's sons and goes all the way down now to David. So again, there's something going on there, and I think the author of Ruth actually understood what was going on in Genesis. Lately, I've actually taken to calculating this. If we assume that these are just randomly positioned people, right? It just happened randomly that way. Well, you can actually do the mathematical calculations, and I won't bore your readers with this. I've actually posted a paper on my Academia EDU site, not a peer-reviewed paper, just something I put out there for people that have written me and said, well, how come this couldn't just be random? So you can actually calculate this, and it's much less than 1% chance. It's like in the area of 1/1000th of 1% that it's random. Or if you want to flip that around, it's well over 99% chance that it's planned. You can actually do the calculations. Let's just assume it's random, and just use probability theory, right, and figure it out. So this says to me, there's a slight little chance, it's not 0, but it's certainly very close to 0, that this is random. It has to be, in my mind, something that the author did, Moses did, in order to position these people at strategic positions in the genealogies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, on the topic of symbolism, there's 2 people that stand out, like, by far. So you have Enoch, who died or was taken up at 365, and obviously that, they were very particular about their numbers and their astronomy and, the stars and all that. And also Lamech, who dies at 777, which, 777, that has to be symbolic, right? I mean, do you think that those are symbolic at all?
Well, actually, the Lamech at 777, I think, is the one place in the genealogies where the Masoretic text has been changed.
Oh, okay.
If you compare it to the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, they tend to reduce the number by 100. So you'd expect to be 677, but it's a completely different number in the Septuagint. And the pattern, you reduce it there's a pattern between the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text. The pattern would suggest that the Septuagint, you just add 100 to it and get the right number, and And the Samaritan Pentateuch, the same thing.
Hmm.
So I think somebody's actually changed Enoch. Why? Well, there's two Enochs. There's not just the guy who's taken up into heaven. There's an Enoch in the line of Cain that we read about in Genesis 4.
Hmm.
Um, right. And interestingly enough, the seventh guy in the line from Cain is a fellow who brags about killing a man. He says if Cain is going to be avenged 70 times or
Hmm.
7 times, then I will be avenged 70, 70 or 77. The mind doesn't work. But at any rate, it's based on
It's
seven, right?
77. Yeah.
77, yeah. Thank you. I sometimes the mind does funny things to you. 77 times. So I think they come to this godly Enoch in the line of Seth, and they say, well, if those guys are 7 and 77, we have to make him even better. So they change the number to
Yeah.
777. So there, I think it's symbolic, but it's a conscious change to the text in the
Yeah.
Masoretic text. Again,
Yeah.
my paper on comparing the three texts, Masoretic text, Samaritan Pentateuch, and Septuagint, talks about this.
Hmm.
And why it is. Now, with Enoch being 365,
Hmm.
that's an interesting one. I think he actually lived 365 years.
Okay.
Is it a reference to the days of the year? Maybe, maybe not. Here's why. The most common calendar in the ancient Near East was not our calendar that we use nowadays, which has
Hmm.
365 days 3 times out of 4, right? Um, 365 is approximately a solar year, 365 and a quarter, really. Um, but the most commonly used calendar in antiquity was the solar lunar calendar. You had lunar months of 29, alternating 29 and 30 days, because a lunar month is, when the moon goes through its phases, averages 29 and a half days. So a lunar year, 12 months, comes out to 354 days, not 365.
Hmm.
And then they would add in an extra month every once in a while to square it up with a solar year.
Hmm.
Okay. So that's the calendar that's assumed most elsewhere in the Old Testament. You can see that, and that's how the modern Jewish calendars to this day still works. The Egyptians, however, figured out early on that a solar year is about 365 days. And so, about the 13th century BC, they started having what we call the Egyptian civil year. They had months of 30 days,
Hmm.
12 of them, and then 5 extra days at the end of the year. The ancient Israelites would have known that. It was being used in their day before they left Egypt. They
Hmm.
go down in the 15th century, I believe, and they come out um, after the 13th century. They come out after this civil calendar started being used, but not much after. So,
Hmm.
are they assuming the civil calendar or not? Well, 365 would work for the Egyptian civil calendar. Were they? That's what's being assumed. Everywhere else in the Old Testament, it seems they're not assuming the Egyptian civil calendar.
Hmm.
So 365 may be symbolic.
Hmm.
I'm not going to bet the farm on it.
Yeah, well, obviously you have Jubilees and Book of Enoch, and Book of Enoch is, it seems to be implying that they saw that it was 365 and they thought, hey, he must be connected with the stars and all that, and he must know all about that astronomy and wisdom or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah,
So,
well, and keep in
yeah,
mind the Book of Enoch is much later, and by
right.
then you have the Roman calendars, which have 365 days in
Mm,
them. The Julian calendar had 365 days, very similar to our calendar with 365 days.
mm,
So by then they would have known 365, and when the Book of Enoch was being written,
mm.
and their audience could assume it. That's a little bit different with Genesis audience.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That case with Lamech. That's I haven't heard that one before. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's see if we got anything else here. Let's see. Oh, last question here. All right, Sumerian kings list. So obviously you have these long list of kings' reigns, thousands and thousands of years, um, and they just happen to go down after the flood. So they're, you know, tens of thousands of years, and then all of a sudden they drop off right after the flood, just like Genesis does. Now in Genesis, you have it's not completely dropped off. Like it's Abraham of 175,
Right.
and it's around 100 years, somewhere around there, which is a lot compared to what they typically recorded back then. So, long story short, the Sumerian Kings list. What do you think's going on there? Does that play any influence on how you interpret Genesis?
Not really. I think, if anything, the king list, it is simply a kind of a garbled recollection of what actually happened.
Okay.
I think that's probably what's going on. You know, Moses, everything he writes in Genesis happened well before his lifetime. He had to have sources for it. I don't know what his sources were, but he had to have sources for all of that. He wasn't a firsthand witness to any of it. And as if you want to think about this in an extreme example, creation. Adam wasn't a witness to most of what happened at creation, right?
Mm,
It had to be revealed to Moses. Maybe some of these things were written records from his days. Maybe some of these things were revealed directly by God to Moses. But it seems to me that the king list is probably a garbled recollection of the truth. The truth is found in Genesis. And the king's list is, oh, well, we remember something about long lived people. We remember something about a flood. But they get it all messed up. It's, like that old game telephone, when something is told generation after generation and it gets garbled.
mhm.
Um, and that's, I suspect, is what's going on in the Samaritan king, and not Samaritan,
Sumerian.
Sumerian king list. The Sumerian king list is simply a garbled real recollection of what
Mm,
actually happened.
yeah.
So I think there's probably some relationship to Genesis, but I don't think it's direct, and I don't think it's anything to be overly concerned about.
Mm, gotcha. Okay. All right. Yeah. No, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on here.
Well,
Is the
thank you. It's,
Yeah.
it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm glad we could discuss some of these issues.
Yeah, yeah, this is great to get people more familiar on the topic here. Is there any books that you're writing that you want people to know about? Different places they can check out your work, stuff like that?
Yeah, well, if they go to academia.edu and look up my name, they can find all my published papers there, and a couple papers I put up there that haven't been published anywhere. I just published them there. But most of them are peer reviewed scholarly papers. Also, all my books are listed there. I had a book just published um, called The Messianic Message, which I co wrote with my friend R. Reed Lessing, where we talk about the Old Testament's messianic message, and how important it is to see the Messiah, whom I believe is Jesus, in the Old Testament. Just published from Concordia Publishing House last month. So that's a book, not very expensive, written for a lay audience, that people might be interested in. And then I think on the 5th of October, um, Crossway is going to publish the ESV Chronological Bible. I was the general editor for that. Um, the Bible is arranged in the chronological order of the events,
Hmm.
um, and organized into 365 readings day by day.
Oh, wow.
So you can read through it in a year. The ESV Chronological Bible contains my introductions to each day's reading, my
Hmm.
um, I'm the one who divided it into 365. It contains my view of chronology. It has a nice timeline in the back. I've got a few advanced copies, so I know exactly what it looks like. Um, and if readers are interested in a chronological Bible and reading things in chronological order,
Yeah.
um, it's there. And I wrote all the introductions and edited it into 365 readings. So those are my two latest works. And if people are interested in my chronology from Abraham to Paul, a biblical chronology, you can go to academia.edu or the Concordia Publishing House website, and it's listed there. And other things that most people won't be interested in, like my Aramaic grammar, are also there too.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that Bible sounds really, really cool. We might have to talk about that later sometime. But thanks you so much for coming on here. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, Dr. Steinmann.
Okay, thank you, Zach. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Hmm.